So good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. Welcome to the RIEL Seminar Series 2024, session number 17. We would like to start by respectfully acknowledging the First Nations people of this country and recognize their continuing connections to their lands, waters, and communities. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and remain committed to working together to care for this land. Sorry for the delay, but we had to deal with special situations for today as we were expecting a higher public than usual. But for our online participants, we are here in Darwin, the Northern Territory, Charles Darwin University, Yellow Building 1 in the Savannah room, but we are also today on the overflow room, downstairs, Yellow 1, room number 33. So if anyone would like to be redirected there, feel free to go. Nevertheless, the seminar conditions remain the same. We have overhead microphones over both rooms, so please try to be quiet because we are streaming and recording the whole seminar today. And in case of hearing the fire alarm, just walk the same way in reverse. So pretty easy, right? Today, the topic is Researcher Perspectives on the Middle Arm Industrial Precinct, presented by Stefan Enciso, PhD candidate here at the Northern Institute. We also have Billee McGinley, a geospatial scientist and a PhD candidate in RIEL, and Colton Perna, also PhD candidate in RIEL. And we will have 45 minutes allocated for that talk. So starting from now. And please save your questions for the end of the seminar. So guys, welcome, and the stage is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Rafa. Welcome, everybody. Just a brief note, Billy and Stefan and myself and a few others have gotten together over the past few months, just as concerned academics about the proposed developments that are coming to the Northern Territory from an academic point of view. Just wanted to have some more input into those things in these kind of forums. So we thought this would be a great way to start that off and hopefully get other people to sort of contribute their expertise. So, okay. There we go. So first, I just wanted to address some of my potential conflicts of interest. I have worked with both the NT government and GHD to do biodiversity assessments and impact assessments on the Arrows project, which I'll be talking about in a minute in its relationship to the Middle Arm development. But I won't be referencing or presenting any of that data. There's confidentiality around that. And what I mainly want to speak about today, too, is my concerns both as a scientist and as a citizen in relation to these developments and what I've gleaned from reading the NT government documents on such. So the Middle Arm development is it's a precinct and it's being presented as a sustainability development. However, as far as I can tell, nearly 75% of that is going to be gas related. And it's going to be directly linked to the extraction, processing, and advanced manufacturing of that gas. The project can also only economically be feasible by direct public funding input to create infrastructure such as multi-use jetties, rail, and pipelines to facilitate this process and export of gas and other manufactured products. Most importantly, for Middle Arm to operate, the impacts of this project spread from the 1,500 hectare development site, which is in Middle Arm in Darwin Harbor, to the Adelaide River. This is the proposed Arrows Dam or off-channel water storage, and then down into the Roper River into the Billee Basin. So Arrows will supply the water for the manufacturing, and I'll get into other uses of that water. And then the Billee Basin will supply the gas as well as the offshore supply from Barossa. So when we talk about Middle Arm and the way it's presented is it's just going to be this impact here in Darwin. But my concern is that I don't think there's a lot of knowledge about how there's quite a few other impacts that are coming with that, especially the fact that there's two relatively healthy, free-flowing rivers that are going to be impacted by this development. So some of the background on the advanced manufacturing, which will include fertilizers and plastics, and the gas industry. So there's a breakdown here of the things that will be created, and 74.3% of that is going to be gas related or petrochemical related. I will be focusing here on the links to ARROS, which is the Adelaide River Off-Channel Water Storage Scheme, and how that's intended to supply water for this development. Billee's going to present after Stefan some of the impacts and potential contaminations and water uses of the fracking down in the Roper River. So ARROS, basically, it's a flood harvest scheme where water, a pump will be put into the Adelaide River here, pumped into a large basin. Any low-lying areas of this basin are going to be backfilled to create a dam so that the water will stay in the basin. Then that water will be pumped into a pipeline down, joining the pipeline from the Darwin River Dam, and then there'll be associated water treatment and other facilities to get that water to the end users. That water will be used for a couple different things, and I'll discuss that in a minute. But the estimated capacity of the ARROS project will be about 250 gigaliters a year, and the supply capacity of 60. In comparison, the Darwin River Dam is a bit bigger, but the supply is a little bit lower due to the fact that there's a lot of low-lying vegetation and they can't actually pull water from deeper. So the supply from Darwin River Dam is only 32 gigaliters per year. It is also an intention to bring the Mountain Dam back online in between now and when ARROS is fully operation to supply the water needs. Oops. So basically the breakdown, as far as I can tell from water security, is the industrial sector at Middle Arm will take about 27,000 megaliters per year. There's varying different numbers on this depending on where you get the information. I'm going to stick with that one. That's from water security. The agricultural expansion, which they're talking about in the Lambles Lagoon precinct, will take about 17,000 megaliters per year. And then water security for population growth. There's a couple different sort of urban semi-rural proposals, one at Maracay and one at what they used to call Nunama Ridge, and now it's being called Lloyd's Creek. So that's kind of the proposal for the 11,000 megaliters per year. But as with many water use industries, such as industrial and agricultural, there's a large focus on the water input. So we calculate extra, what we need to use. What is not quite often referred to is all of those, industrial and agricultural have wastewater products, tailwater from agriculture and wastewater from industry. And that has not necessarily been covered in what I've read, but it will have a significant concern once these things are in operation and developed. What is not often mentioned is the unique nature of the Adelaide River system. And this is what I wanted to get to in the impacts from developing this water harvesting scheme. The Adelaide River is one of the unique rivers in the top end because it has a natural bedrock constriction, holding floodwaters back and allowing freshwater flows to extend past the wet season. And also inundation times for that floodwater up onto the floodplain, which is really important for quite a few different reasons. So removing large volumes of water, as I showed you in that basin, will reduce flows downstream potentially. And the impacts of this is it will potentially reduce the extent and duration of flooding onto the floodplain. We know that the floodplains supply a huge amount of food into the food webs and also nursery areas for a lot of floodplain associated fish species. And this could have an impact on those, as well as by removing that head of water, it may alter both the sediment regime, the natural sediment regime, and the salinity regime. So if you remove that freshwater pressure coming down, it's possible saltwater intrusion could come up into the groundwater as well as up into the river, which are both things of very big concern. So recently, I've completed analysis of fish trophic richness across all of the tropical rivers in Australia. And we found that piscivores, herbivores, detritivores, and piscivores were strongly related to wet season flows, and all of the different trophic groups, as well as total species richness, were related to dry season base flows. So that's calculated in mean daily flow. So these represent what's the significant relationships we found across the multiple flow variables that we analyzed. This is important as changes to wet season flows may reduce floodplain inundation and duration, and therefore impact the herbivore detritivore diversity and possibly abundance, which the piscivores then rely on as forage. So by reducing these flows and then potentially reducing the food availability for herbivore detritivores and the hunting grounds for piscivores, you could reduce the species diversity and potentially abundance of those groups of fish. Furthermore, the removal of wet season water may reduce groundwater recharge, reducing dry season flows and impacting all fish trophic yields across the Adelaide River. These are potentials based on the modeling that we've done. Don't know if this could happen, but it's definitely worth investigating further. There's also the potential that demand may outstrip evaporative and soil ingress losses to the storage basin, requiring pumping in the dry months to maintain supply, which would then furthermore impact those daily dry season flows. So my take-home message I would like to give is that rivers of the north are being considered for their water resources, and there's an opportunity for independent scientific advisory to these projects. CDU and RIEL are ideally located to provide this to the local Northern Territory government, should the government be interested in this collaboration. There has been common practice in the development of water resource plans in Queensland to have scientific advisory committees at each level, at each water resource development plan, and that's been quite successful. This would not replace the need for stakeholder engagement as well for those living within the plan boundaries, which is also a great tool for understanding water resource uses by the locals, as well as our relationship to aquatic ecosystems and how water is used. I would like to close by suggesting that our rivers are some of the last free-flowing rivers on the globe, and that water flowing from the source to the sea is in no way wasted, but utilized by the ecosystem and animals and plants within each catchment, as well as providing food, recreation, and traditional connection to all territory residents and visitors. Any water resource development should be viewed with the highest level of precautionary principles to avoid the mistakes made in southern states, as well as preventing good intention followed by failed outcomes, leaving environment in far worse condition than before, which impacts us all. Thanks.
Thanks, Colton. Good morning, everyone. My name is Stefan Enciso. I teach philosophy here in the Faculty of Arts, and it's great to see these collaborations between the sciences and the humanities. Part of what I want to do today is to show that the humanities have an important role to play in these bigger picture conversations about the future of the territory. Specifically, I want to do three things today. I want to outline a working conception of the common good that I think should be guiding us in our moral decisions. Then I want to examine the Middle Arm project and suggest that it's not in the common good. And finally, I want to reflect on what our duties are as academics living on the front lines of fossil fuel expansion. But before going any further, I'd like to pay my respects to the Larrakia people on whose land I'm speaking and point out that Larrakia people told the Senate inquiry they had not been properly consulted about this project and had not given their free, prior and informed consent. So what is the common good? There are many ways of conceptualizing the common good. One way, associated with liberal theories of justice, reduces the common good to individual flourishing, where the individual is conceived as a potentially property owning and wealth maximizing person divorced from nature. As some have put it, the liberal idea of justice has always been based on human exceptionalism and separation from the rest of the natural world. The natural world in such theories is seen as a playground over which humans can exercise
their control. As the father of liberalism, John Locke, explained approvingly, invoking the book of Genesis, humans acquired dominion over the fowls of the air and the fishes of the sea and the terrestrial creatures. Under capitalism, this human separation from the natural world is taken to new extremes, with nature treated as a tap from which resources can be endlessly extracted for private gain, and as a sink for endless dumping of waste products. In setting up this dynamic, the structures of capitalism simply ignore the ecological costs that exploitation of the natural world generates, leading to a situation where, as Nancy Fraser puts it, the serpent tends to eat its own tail, cannibalizing the very conditions on which it relies. An alternative perspective on the common good takes the community or the collective as the starting point. Many Indigenous philosophies have done this, formulating anti-liberal and anti-capitalist frameworks. Glenn Coulthard, for example, introduces the concept of grounded normativity, which he says is antithetical to capitalist accumulation. Grounded normativity is based on the land as a system of reciprocal relationships that teach us about how to live in respectful, non-dominating and non-exploitative ways. Mary Graham makes a similar point when she calls for a collective identity inhabited by Indigenous and non-Indigenous people based on simply looking after land. Indeed, Indigenous philosophies have stressed the need to acknowledge how the human and the non-human world are fundamentally entangled. Christine Winter, for example, contrasts the liberal society with what she calls a relational society, in which production is oriented towards sufficiency and natural resources are the subject of custodial care for transfer to future generations. I won't resolve disputes between liberals and anti-liberals here, but I do want to merge some insights from both traditions to suggest the following working conception of the common good. The common good is guaranteeing the conditions for our future reproduction within ecological limits. From this working conception comes the test. Whether a project is in the common good depends on whether it undermines those conditions for our future reproduction. Creating unacceptable climate, health and environmental risks, for example, would be a way to fail the test, and using public money to create those risks would be an aggravating factor. What is the Middle Arm project? Thanks, Colton, for introducing this. The Middle Arm project is a fossil fuel project. The peninsula has actually been for decades a target of gas industry expansion. Current plans for the project include bringing in offshore and onshore gas, including from fracking in the Billee Basin, to establish a range of gas-based industries, including petrochemicals manufacturing. The harbour will have to be dredged, and 1,500 hectares of land is at risk of being cleared to make way for this development. That is a key pillar in the Northern Territory government's aim to achieve a $40 billion economy by 2030. The federal government is the key player in this, having committed at least $1.5 billion, but certainly more, to build critical infrastructure and help the project proceed. Evidence presented to the recent Senate inquiry into this project showed why the project is not in the common good. If we start with the climate impacts, let's remember that the IPCC said last year, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees requires rapid and immediate greenhouse gas emissions reductions in all sectors this decade. Independent modelling has shown that the Middle Arm project could increase NT emissions by 75%, potentially making it the greatest greenhouse gas emitter in the Northern Territory. And that's without taking into account emissions from fracking in the Billee Basin, for example, or from offshore gas projects like the Barossa gas field. Indeed, the climate impacts of big projects like Middle Arm is the reason the United Nations has started describing the territory as a climate change sacrifice zone. If the climate impacts weren't bad enough, evidence also suggested the impacts on human and non-human health could be severe from increases in air pollution and other forms of contamination. Public health experts discussed international research showing that living within a few kilometres of a facility like Middle Arm dramatically increases your risk of cancer and other respiratory illnesses. Independent modelling also showed that worsening air quality from proximity to a facility like Middle Arm could lead to an extra 15 premature deaths per year, as well as an increase in the industrial cancer hazard in the region. Those weren't the only health impacts. The planned dredging of the harbour may worsen water quality through releasing sediments that increase turbidity, impacting fish and fishing in the area, Petrochemical wastewater could contaminate mangrove ecosystems, causing accumulation of heavy metals, and the habitats of migratory shorebirds could be decimated from the land clearing that's being planned. You might be tempted to say these negatives will be worth it because of the increased royalties and taxes that we'll get from all of these developments, money that we could use to give every resident of Palmerston a gas mask, for example. But the gas industry has a history of contributing very little to the territory economy. The tax office describes the gas industry as a systemic non-payer of tax. A few years ago, INPEX paid no tax on nearly $4 billion worth of income. And as far as royalties are concerned, firstly, half the gas exported from Australia pays no royalties, but modelling suggests that even if full-scale fracking goes ahead, it will bring in less than 1% of the NT government's total budget in increased revenue. Given this history, we should be suspicious of the $40 billion economy objective if it relies on gas-based manufacturing. So the Middle Arm project will, on the evidence that I've given you here, invest at least $1.5 billion of public money in worsening global warming, making humans and non-humans sick, and allowing gas companies to keep the profits. I suggest then the clear outcome is the Middle Arm project is not set up to guarantee the conditions for our future reproductions within ecological limits. What follows? If you're an academic living in a climate change sacrifice zone, what is it incumbent on you/us to do? My proposed answer is we have to do everything we can to denormalize fossil fuel expansion by invoking this concept of the common good and showing it's not in the common good to continue this way. 5 years ago, researchers said the precise level of future warming depends on infrastructure that hasn't been built yet. Stopping that infrastructure from being built, even if significant investments have already been made, is essential for halting further warming. In other words, there will have to be stranded assets and stranded investments if we care about climate justice and the common good. The fact that there continue to be investments in fossil fuel projects is an indication that investors do not believe in future climate policy or that they're confident in their own lobbying power. We know that the gas industry in the territory is very confident about its influence in politics. The Senate inquiry highlighted the extent of this corporate influence. For example, the $1.5 billion federal commitment was secured through lobbying efforts connected to the gas industry. So much so that the inquiry recommended removing the influence of the fossil fuel industry from politics and banning political donations from fossil fuel companies. Territory and federal governments are pushing ahead with Middle Arm and expansion of the gas industry, despite the risks that these projects pose for the common good. The first COP, the climate conference, was held in 1995, the year I was born, incidentally. Even then, there were activists outside chanting, "No more blah, 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 action now." In 2022, the International Energy Agency reported an extraordinarily profitable year for the fossil fuel industry. And in 2023, fossil fuel emissions reached a record high after COP number 28. In these circumstances, and as Andreas Malm puts it, to say that the signals have fallen on the deaf ears of the ruling classes of this world would be an understatement. There can be no doubt that they are constitutionally incapable of responding to the catastrophe in any other way than by expediting it. In these circumstances, there's a burgeoning field of research asking the question, what are the moral responses actually needed to address the climate crisis? Some criminologists, for example, have suggested the consumption of fossil fuels must be criminalized. My point here is that CDU is on the front lines of massive fossil fuel expansion, and so we're actually uniquely placed to make contributions to this literature with the possibility of real-world impact, helping communities on the ground understand how they ought to respond to the threats that they face. Is the work of Andreas Malm a good place to start? Malm argues for the necessity of intelligent sabotage of fossil fuel infrastructure to create a disincentive to invest in more of it and to force the state to ban fossil fuel projects and rapidly transition. In other words, he says that the investment risk needs to be created by activists to scare the companies away from destroying the planet. Malm critiques the philosophy of non-violence that he claims is prevalent in the climate movement in groups like Extinction Rebellion, and he raises interesting questions such as, can you actually do violence against physical objects? There's a debate in the literature about this, which I won't get into, but what is clear is that we tend to think violence is justified in self-defense. So one question that arises is, can we damage and destroy emitting devices in self-defense against ecological collapse? Ma'am reminds us that radical activity has played an essential role in securing reforms that we all take for granted. For example, the suffragettes who won women the right to vote systematically engaged in property damage against private and public property as part of their ultimately successful campaign. Verity Bergman puts it well when she says, reforms are more likely to be achieved when activists behave in extremist, even confrontational ways. Ma'am's point is that this insight has not been effectively appreciated in the climate movement, where he says there's a rule against doing damage to property, even though that property, like fracking equipment, is making the climate problem worse. I don't have a final position on whether Ma'am's analysis is right or the more general questions that he raises, but I do think we're the best placed university in Australia for proposing answers to these questions. If our goal is to protect the common good, and if our governments hand in hand with industry are fully committed to undermining that goal through continued fossil fuel expansion, then what are we justified in doing individually and collectively to stop that expansion? These are the coordinates of a philosophical conversation that we are not currently having at CDU, to our detriment and to the disappointment of people who look to the universities as a source of moral leadership and philosophical reflection. The duty is on us as academics to discuss these bigger picture questions about what protecting our livelihoods might actually require of us. To give you a brief summary of what I've talked about in this presentation, I outlined a conception of the common good based on Indigenous critiques of Western liberal theories, in which the common good is guaranteeing conditions for our future reproduction while respecting ecological limits. Then I gave you reasons to think that the Middle Arm project, as currently conceived, is not in the common good because of the climate, health, and environmental risks that it proposes, with no guarantee of economic benefits that we could use to repair some of those costs. And finally, I suggested that we're uniquely placed here at CDU to investigate the morality of different responses to stopping fossil fuel expansion. Thank you.
Hi, I'm a PhD candidate at RIEL at CDU. My research project is actually about spatial analysis to think about regional planning of large-scale solar and wind energy. However, today I'll be talking about the implications of onshore unconventional shale gas mining involving hydraulic fracturing, commonly called fracking, in the petroleum prospect region that has already been mentioned, the Billee Basin in the Barkly region of the NT. And I'll be specifically thinking about the cumulative impacts of pollution and land clearing in the Newcastle Creek catchment that in the region that the Billee Basin encompasses. This is a catchment of a Ramsar quality wetland system that includes two distinguished but connected wetlands, Lakewoods and Longreach Protected Waterhole being their colonial names. The two features are on two different pastoral leases and two different native title areas with many language groups and families associated. But better than me introducing this wetland, I have a short video clip I can show of a traditional custodian of parts of this wetland, Ray Dixon, Mapparamam from Marlington community, and he'll tell you the language. There's also a link in the chat too if it's not working.
Ya, jauh je, ayo pernah. Cakap di. Mana jana ini nunggu, benga. Lewat ngayo, lewat nginya benga. Mantap. And this This water all here. This water nganko, the beat low, high field, patpa and daily water. That water come from there, from top to Malinja, through to Malinja, through to Ichibara, and then from Ichibara, they go to Jikaya then. We got song line travel from this area here, right through. This story is very important for us, and especially water, and it's the whole our culture, our story, and we want to keep that for our next generation, and they can tell that story then.
So why am I talking about fracking when my PhD research is on renewable energy? I've lived and worked in the top end of the NT for over 20 years. Before undertaking my PhD since 2016 out of concern, and as an environmental consultant, I've been engaged in researching the implications of proposed fracking in the Northern Territory. However, there are some synergies with my current research. My research is focused on spatial footprint of regional development of large-scale solar and wind energy, which interestingly, along with landscape-scale fracking, presents a challenge. To evaluate and integrate into land use and conservation planning. Fracking industrialises vast landscapes, clearing extensive areas of vegetation for networks of gas wells, access roads, and open toxic wastewater ponds. It's also an interesting juxtaposition between renewable and fossil fuel energy, alternatives to each other. Yet, unfortunately, yet an unfortunate link to my research is there seems to be a focus in the NT on large-scale renewable energy generation to greenwash fossil fuel developments, like we're seeing with some of the renewable energy projects being directed to middle arm, helping industry make the petrochemical hub, market the petrochemical hub as a sustainability hub. So to be clear, this presentation sits separately from my PhD research, and my PhD research does not seek to support renewable energy projects being used to greenwash new fossil fuel projects in a climate crisis. Gas is definitely not a transition fuel, and we can rapidly transition to renewable energy. So why am I talking about the Billee Basin when this talk is about middle arm? I think we've already explained there's a strong link with middle arm and the fracking in the Billee Basin. It is no doubt an enabler and intrinsically linked to fracking. And the petrochemical industrial precinct for the top end was first proposed in this Territory Economic Reconstruction final report, seeing this precinct as essential manufacturing to capitalise on fracking in the Billee Basin. The commission was co-chaired by two gas lobbyists, Paul Henderson, you may be familiar with, the CU's Chancellor, has recently resigned, also Director of Bespoke Territory, dealing with proponents at Middle Arm. The other was Andrew Liveris, who was Darwin born but has worked overseas for many years and was the CEO of Dow Petrochemical Corporation for several years. There were definitely perceived conflicts of interest with this commission delivering a post-COVID gas-led economic recovery plan, textbook disaster capitalism. So you can see here the current branch of petroleum exploration areas. The next phase is full production ramp-up phase with a forecast of 200 to 300 wells per year for 3 to 5 years, and then it will slow down to 40 to 50 wells per year for the next decade or two or more. Investigation of cumulative and regional impacts of fracking in the NT from my research perspective have so far been limited. And I'll focus in on Longreach Protected Waterhole, Ichibara and Lakewoods Jikaya wetland system to discuss this. And I'll just generally refer to this wetland system as Lakewoods. I first became aware of Lakewoods on a trip back from Tennant Creek in May 2014. I arrived in the dark to camp and awoke to an oasis, this beautiful wetland bordering the central desert region, thousands of birds, hundreds of pelicans synchronised swimming. When I first saw a map of the proposed fracking in the Barkly, the proximity of this wetland to the proposed fracking gas fields really stood out to me. The wetland is predominantly recharged by surface water flow from the Newcastle Creek following monsoonal rains, draining off the Barkly tablelands, providing 90% of its fill. Long Reach Protected Waterhole in the north holds water most of the year, and Lake Woods is an inferior lake that peaks in the monsoon season. Lake Woods is a losing water body, so the lake water is lost to the underlying groundwater systems, and this map shows that Lake Woods, it doesn't show Lake Woods on there, but it's sort of where that gap is. When the water is lost, it actually goes to both aquifers in the east and the west, which travel north, and it shows some discharge points on this map. And it's thought that it discharges into the Matarang Hot Springs, the Roper River and the Daly River. This regionally connected water system is massive, with tens of thousands of people in the region relying on this water. Lake Woods is likely to meet at least five criteria for listing as a wetland of international importance under the Ramsar Convention. Only one criteria needs to be met for this to be considered. The wetland is estimated at times to support over 100,000 water birds, including internationally significant numbers of plumed whistling duck. The shrubland and wooded areas provide breeding sites for several colonies of water bird species, and large numbers of shorebirds also use a lake for migration stopover, and the Neb permanent waterholes are refuge for many species during the dry season, as well as known to be a refuge for birds in times of drought from down south. There was a scientific inquiry held into fracking in the NT, looking at all the ways to mitigate risks of fracking, which was delivered with over 100 recommendations that would need to be implemented in entirety to keep risks at an acceptable level. One of the most important recommendations to mitigate surface water pollution from the harmful and toxic chemicals used for fracking was recommendation 7.12. To reduce the risk of contamination of surface aquifers from on-site spills of wastewater, that enclosed tanks must be used to hold all wastewater. However, there was significant alteration of this requirement in the Code of Practice, with flexibility to hold water in open ponds, as you can see here. And you can also see on this slide that although the code outlines that water in ponds needs to be removed from site for a significant rainfall event, the water remained after Cyclone Megan. There's also been a strategic regional environmental baseline assessment, which was required before the production phase, which does recognise the high environmental value of Lake Woods and the threat to it, but falls short of providing assurances around surface water contamination, leaving it up to gas companies to do their own inundation mapping and on-site risk assessment. There was also this important recommendation to protect ecological, cultural and other economic values of the NT, being from impacts of expansive fracking gas fields. Interestingly, all these proposed reserve blocks should be declared prior to the grant of any further exploration approvals. However, many remain not declared, including over Lake Woods. I made a very comprehensive submission during the public consultation of this reserve policy, alarmed by how little went into mapping this important reserve system, and also amplified my concern for Lake Woods. Interestingly, my current research has shown just avoiding protected areas and the recognised sites of conservation significance fall short of providing a safety net for biodiversity in the NT. After the submission, the Environmental Defenders Office agreed to help to further interrogate the threat of fracking to Lake Woods, exploring what an appropriate buffer would be to protect its values and options for greater protection. Very fortunately, Professor Max Finlayson, an internationally renowned wetland ecologist, agreed to provide the assessment. Max is an adjunct professor at Charles Sturt University, and the University of New South Wales, but importantly, his experience includes 25 years with the Ramsar Convention as an independent and technical advisor through the convention's scientific and technical review panel. So it's not peer review, but I trust it has value. Max was confident the lake is of national and international importance and could be designated as such under the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. Max also commented that improving the database or more surveys of lake woods would not improve the certainty of this and not otherwise detract from that conclusion. He emphasised later in the report he is surprised it is not already listed and there's little question about its eligibility. In regards to appropriate protection under the reserve policy, Max is clear conserving only a core area that was more often inundated than other areas of the lake would fly in the face of current ecological wisdom that highlights the importance of connectivity across landscapes. Max also made clear the convention is not a narrow-based conservation or protectionist agreement. It is based fully on the premise of wise use and maintenance of ecological character, which needs to take into account catchment and multiple impacts. He states there is no evidence that the proposed exploration activities would not have adverse impacts. Hence, they cannot be considered as wise use. It's not worth the risk. He also clarified that the current land tenure is not impediment to itself to being listed. The intensity of the pastoral management seems to be compatible with maintaining the ecological values. I too agree there is definitely no evidence that fracking can be done safely, and I can do a whole other presentation on that. So from all of this assessments and knowledge, I recommend that there needs to be a serious review of the assessments on water risk, considering important recommendations have not been implemented. Further investigation of an appropriate buffer or no-go zone that protects the integrity of the wetland's ecological character. This map here shows the various boundaries of the conservation area that's there at the moment, the recognised site of conservation significance, and the strategic regional environmental baseline assessment suggested extending the no-go zone a bit north, but I also had another assessment done through the EDO by Tim Cohen, who's a professor at the University of Wollongong, who has been studying that mega lake for a long time, and he did an assessment of the hydrological bounds of lake woods to clarify physically what currently we should consider its boundaries, and he assessed it should be the 210 metre contour on that map. I think there also needs to be a review of the petroleum reserve policy. Much more mapping of values needs to be done. And with governments often changing, there is no certainty for upholding the protections currently in place. So really the only way to assure protection of this wetland to assess catchment-wide implications is through the Ramsar Convention.
So thank you very much to our speakers for keeping the time and for showing these different perspectives on the Middle Arm Industrial Precinct. As you know, now we have to coordinate among 3 rooms. So here, downstairs, and the virtual room. And so we would like to open for questions. We have 15 minutes for that. And for the ones in our room, please raise your hand and keep it raised, because I will give you a signal when you can proceed. We'll try to keep the idea that we take 2-3 questions here and then switch among the rooms. For online participants, please use the chat. We're gonna read out loud your questions or even comments, okay? And please be short, stick to the topic, and refer to any of our speakers if you would like a specific answer. Thank you. So happy to start.
Stefan, you mentioned philosophical discussions, and we're all part of Faculty of Science and Technology, and the conspicuous absence of Energy and Resources Institute. Have you started with them? Initiated any discussions?
No, I haven't, but that's a great idea. I could reach out to them and to the North Australian Centre for Oil and Gas as well and have a big collective discussion.
Anyone else?
We do have a question online here. This is from Craig for Billee. A little bit of a long one. Hang on a second. Okay, so the impact on water from the Billee Basin fracking projects is set to be assessed by an independent scientific committee. The committee will determine whether the Federal Environment Minister should pull the water trigger on Billee projects. If pulled, the trigger will ensure water impacts are scrutinised by the Commonwealth under national laws. Based on your assessment, do you think the water trigger will be pulled?
I actually haven't thought about that in the context of the water trigger myself. I suppose I've always thought about the water trigger as thinking about the quantity of water being used, but and just on that as well, I should have probably mentioned, because you were talking about the Roper River, that the enormous consumption of groundwater in the Billee Basin for the fracking process will, as Colton pointed out, could have impacts on the flows in the Roper River. So I suppose my thoughts be more about that, but we've got someone that's very experienced on the water trigger here. Does surface water pollution, Jenny, is that part of the water trigger? Yeah.
I'm bound by confidentiality because I'm a member of that committee.
Okay. Yeah.
But I can say at this point the Commonwealth is taking the activity very seriously.
Yeah. And so if there was major concerns about surface water pollution, that could be a trigger for the water trigger, or we can't say that.
I think, I don't know what I can say actually without, it's being taken really, really seriously by the Commonwealth Act.
Yeah, I think
that's all I can say.
Yeah.
I guess I could add there, the water trigger is one thing, but clearly there are such huge climate implications that perhaps to rely on the water trigger as a way of slowing down or stopping onshore gas, is really only the tip of that little iceberg. There's a definite climate issue here that we don't seem to have any ability to address. That's my take on it. But I guess I wanted to get back to Colton's talk. I mean, it's been fantastic to hear these different perspectives and to hear a philosophical approach, because as a scientist, I'm often not engaged in those kind of conversations. Perhaps like most other researchers, I'm always so busy just trying to get on with the things I'm meant to be doing on individual projects. So it's really good to hear that. But Colton, I guess getting back to things that you were referring to, it really worries me that we seem to have arrived at a point where things are so polarised between people who want to protect the NT environment, to protect the things that we value enormously about NT water in particular, and that extends to recreational fishers who are normally not necessarily regarded as conservationists. And we seem to have a territory government who is maintaining a position that is not listening at all. To me, that's an incredibly polarised position. And how do we move beyond that polarisation? Because it will achieve nothing at this point. It seems to be so entrenched that we're right and everyone else is wrong. That's what I've been coming up against. Everything I've tried to put forward, it's like, yours is just an opinion, you are wrong, we're right. How do we get to a situation where our government is so defensive and refusing to listen?
I suppose, yeah, and I suppose this is what this seminar is about too, is just, I suppose, having some narrative, making the opportunity ourselves to have a little bit of narrative in these discussions, because we're not being invited sometimes, or it can be frustrating as an environmental scientist to have the science ignored. But Colton,
well, I think that's what I was trying to, the point I was trying to make is that there's a lot of interest from what I'm gauging here at CDU to utilize the expertise that we do have. We've got really, really excellent expertise in aquatic ecology and other things here that can be utilized to advise these developments. And there's examples from other states where these advisory committees are formed and utilized to develop and direct these water resource development plans, because, you know, my feeling with solid about whether or not we should be developing these water resources up here, it needs to be done, like I said, with the utmost precautionary principle, because what we've seen in the South is once the development's done, there's no going back. There's no fixing. I mean, you've got the example, for instance, in the territory where they moved the river, the whole river of the MacArthur River to get to the Orne, and then they said they've restored it. Well, it's not necessarily the story of some people, but we can do these things in a collaborative way. And I think what we're trying to do here is put the hand out off of the olive branch to the state government, and we've got an opportunity with the new state government maybe to establish that relationship and start having more of a collaborative relationship rather than combative one, because there has been some tendency in the past for it to be combative. Some of our scientists have been singled out in the media for their expertise opinion, which I don't necessarily think is fair. If it's something that you know and that's what you do as a career, that should be respected. So hopefully from here we can form up some sort of relationships, functional relationships, and non-combative. You're right, Jen. It has become, the world definitely has become a much more polarized place than it has been. It's very hard to speak across the table.
Ready for the next question? Someone would have. Otherwise, we go online.
Yeah. We just had a comment that some people online are having trouble hearing, so if the presenters could just speak extra loud for us. And there's a few questions here. We may not get to every single one, but the next one is Judy. She is wondering, sorry, is there effort towards Ramsar and where is it up to at the moment?
Yeah, I'm not sure where things are up to. So that information was provided. Well, I know definitely, like when I first started getting a bit fixated on Lake Woods, I always feel uncomfortable talking about other people's country without permission. So I did actually ask Ray, is it okay if I talk about this and my concerns about threat to fracking? And is it okay, you know, if the EDO do some more investigation? And so I know that Ray, who's in the Mullinger community, just north of Lake Woods in Ichibaba area, the Longreach Protected Waterhole, have a real appetite to be involved in conservation there, and, you know, have aspirations of ranger groups and things like that. So I think there has been some stuff in the background. I've kind of left that space during my PhD, so I'm not privy to where things are up to, but I think there's definitely an appetite to have that place better protected. But I'm not sure about any effort towards Ramsar listing, and I don't even know where to start. You know, instigating something like that and who needs to be involved. But, you know, the cattlemen or the pastoral leaseholders, you know, their business wouldn't be under threat. Their traditional owners want to be involved in conservation. So I think there's no stakeholders involved that would stop that from happening. I think there does need to be agreement, and maybe it needs to be put forward by the territory government. When I first took this to, when I first spoke to Max, he was very excited. I think it was coming up to the 50-year anniversary of the Ramsar Convention. And he was like, this would be a perfect new listing to have to celebrate that.
I just add something to that. I'm not sure if people here realise that the territory only has 2 listed Ramsar wetlands, and that was the very first one at Coburg Peninsula, and now also Kakadu is a listed Ramsar wetland. But given the importance of the water bodies that are present in the territory, I think it's absolutely, just take the fact that we only have 2 Ramsar listed wetlands. 30 years ago, when I first started working, 40 years ago, on water bodies in Central Australia, I talked to someone from the NT government about how important the springs down there were, and they would make ideal, it would be an ideal for a Ramsar listing. They agreed, but at the time they said the territory does not want anyone else interfering with how we manage our land and waters. And I'm sorry to say, I don't think that philosophy has changed. So that's what we're up against. And now with Ramsar, it is really important that you get all stakeholders to agree. So it's actually become very difficult to get Ramsar listings, where you've got even one group who are saying, we don't want anyone telling us how to manage that water well.
Any other questions in the room? Keller.
Thanks everyone for the presentations. My questions to Stefan. I really like the idea of using common good as a guiding principle for making decisions like this that affect all of us. But like Jenny, I sit in my science box and I do my science, and I do that for several reasons. And one reason is to maintain independence and not be perceived as others as advocating for one thing or another, and to be doing independent science. So I guess my question is, do you have any ideas about how scientists and philosophers can work together to, I guess, use science to manage natural resources in the best way possible for common good? And do you have any suggestions for that?
I think it's something that should definitely happen, more roundtable discussions or collaborations between the science and the humanities here at CDU, but more broadly. I would maybe say there's no such thing as independent science. Maybe you think that's too strong, but I think science can be utilized in good or bad ways. And I think maybe there's a duty to be imposed on scientists to be aware of how their research is used. Like maybe there's a complicity question there. I don't know, you might think maybe that's too onerous, but these are questions that I think should definitely be considered, especially universities that are on the front lines of these projects, and the government will be looking to, industry will be looking to legitimize them going ahead.
Right, just comment on that. I'm coming to this PhD, I was opened up to a whole world of academia and research integrity and all the ethics approvals. Do you think, I know you're interested in ethics, do you think there's a process, like an approval process, an ethics approval process that projects could go through, an extra one, to ensure that we're working on things that are the common good, or have thresholds for?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe I think I'm suggesting a conversation starter.
Yes,
I'm not saying I have, solutions to this, but I think it's a conversation we're not having at the moment, and we need to start from a different premise. If we know we can't have new fossil fuel projects, then what follows? Like, what procedures do we implement? What protocols do we introduce to make sure that we're on track to achieving that objective, instead of what's happening at the moment, which is completely the opposite?
She had it.
Related to the polarization comment that you had, it's also polarized world in terms of inequality, with very few people controlling about 50% of the world's wealth. So in this situation, institutions also become highly vulnerable. And in that context, how do you see a world, how do we see these things actually materializing in terms of being able to take effective advocacy and, action in this context of polarization of various types: political polarization, economic polarization, social polarization, which I see very strongly in the NT.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's such a good point to raise. There's so much inequality, and there's a concentration of power and wealth at the top. And I think that's part of what the Senate inquiry was actually highlighting when they talked about corporate influence in politics and the need to address that. Fossil fuel companies having a seat at the table when regulations are being discussed that will affect them. Maybe that is not the right way to go about it. We need to ban corporate donations, ban donations from fossil fuel companies and remove their influence in the political system, which is meant to be set up to protect our common good, you know, based on principles of democratic decision making. So if these companies have such an influence in our political system, I think it will just make these inequalities so much worse, you know, in the long run.
I just want to add to that. There's a recent conversation article that Billee shared with me. It's not just the fossil fuels influencing politics. They actually are funding and creating curricula for universities that instills the idea that petrochemicals are the transition. And, you know, that kind of stuff makes it very, very inequitable to be independent, to say that there are alternatives, because we don't have that kind of funding on the other side of the aisle there. So that inequality needs to also come into the university. And, you know, that links to a whole bunch of other ways the university is funded. But yeah, I mean, it's a good point. And just back to colors, you know, like we do sit in our independent seats of science and or philosophy. One thing that I noted when I came to university here from the liberal arts version of it in the United States is there's no requirement for scientists in this country to do philosophy of science, which I think bridges really, really importantly that you know how to do science, but you're not asking why you're doing science without having done philosophy of science. And I think that's something that's really important. It could be reintroduced or introduced here. I mean, it was, I think the first semester I was at JTU, it was an optional, and then it disappeared because the person that taught it never got the classes filled. So I think, and then that helps us to be able to bridge these discussion gaps across our disciplines. And that's something that we don't do a lot of. We really are needing to up our game on our communication skills across discipline and from science to public.
So we still have 4 minutes, and I'll try to get 2 more questions from the online audience.
This is a question for the whole panel from Adam. It's a little long, I'll summarize this one a little bit. Given the current sentiment here at CDU in terms of how some researchers might feel that academic advice is sometimes minimized or dismissed, what do you see as the best course of action for researchers to have their voices heard and respected?
Okay. Well, I suppose we're making an opportunity here, so I think people can make their own opportunities. I recently engaged with CDU Media. You can contact them as an expert anytime and send out an expert alert to respond to anything that's in the public debate. Mine was quite timely when Dutton announced the nuclear plan, so I was picked up by some regional radio station and a review magazine on my thoughts about that, but swinging it back to my research on this, exciting opportunity to transition to renewable energy. So I think you've got to make your own opportunities. I would love to see more robust debate at the universities, actually have a proper debate on is gas a transition fuel, and things like that. I think just not being afraid to, put in your expert opinion as well. And as CDU Media explained in their workshop the other day, they'll approve what you've got to say. You'll send out a little, media release or expert alert. But really, they trust that you are the expert and that you, if you're a PhD student, then maybe check with your supervisor. But I think being not afraid and just helping the narrative in the public arena is important.
Yeah, I agree with what Billee said. I think taking any speaking opportunity is really important. Also, doing research and publishing on this is really important to change that narrative and to be considered, an expert in doing so, to have all of the facts laid out and all of the research to show why middle arm is bad, for example, why fracking shouldn't go ahead, to be pushing this out as much as possible, I think is part of what can address those concerns about academics potentially being censored or not being supported. It's just making it a part of our work and our research to talk about this.
Pretty hard to add to that, but I would say that, having come from Queensland and been on expert panels in relation to these water resource development plans and seeing the work that Jenny's doing on the committees that she's on, I think it's important for us academics also to be involved. I mean, and this is the discussion that we're having at the moment. It is difficult because we're already doing a lot. To be on these committees is a thankless job. We paid for it, but it's a way for us to be involved in these things that are happening. So I would say, outside of the media release in general, things like that, it is important for us to be active locally in any of these committees that do come up.
So, yeah, let's do that. Then we have one more online question, and then you can close. And take it to go.
Online first?
Online first,
Okay,
yeah.
so this is from Beryl. She is thinking about the relationship between Middle Arm and the Elizabeth River. Do you think that more Territorians, sorry, jumping around again. Bear with me. It is in here somewhere. We've got quite a lot of questions in here. Would more Territorians be concerned if they realised a threat to the health of the river as well as to surrounding human populations?
Do we think that more Territorians would be concerned?
If they were aware of the threat, not only to the health of the river, but also to the surrounding populations?
Yes.
I think yes.
Yeah.
I think if there was an honest discussion about those impacts, and I think that was one of the reasons why we were presenting this, is because quite often these things are presented in isolation as middle arm, as arrows, as Billee, but they're not in isolation. So they're actually quite massive impacts. And I didn't expand on, obviously the footprint of the development itself will have a big impact on the harbor, which is a heavily utilized recreational area, especially middle arm. I use middle arm. It's quite amazing that you can go to middle arm and feel like you're in the middle of a mangrove forest, miles and miles away from an urban area, but you're not. So yeah, I think if people understood what the combined impacts of more export, dredging, wastewater, air quality, all of those things combined, I do think that Territorians are quite concerned about their environment. I mean, that's why people move here largely, is because of the environment.
And I'd probably add that I know a lot of people, including myself, that if Middle Arm goes ahead with the predicted air pollution, I definitely won't be subjecting my daughter to those health risks. It increases leukemia in children by 30%. So yeah, that's, I think, definitely understanding how this could affect human health is really important, but also a lot of us love these beautiful rivers and water places. So, and that's part of why we're here.
Thank you. Just to the previous question about what we can do in this institution, leveraging our platform as CDU. Another possibility, I guess, is to do more give voice and elevate Indigenous positions. CDU aspires to be a leader in teaching, education and research. And so if CDU is to take that position seriously, and if First Nations people are speaking that strongly about caring for the country, then so that's.
Thank you so much for adding that, Stephen. That's really cool. And yeah, I think Ray would be an awesome person to work with. He also makes amazing music as well. Yeah.
Great. So thank you very much.
Thank you.